So, other things being equal, we're all right. Although, I have 2 grown daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are married. They chose to marry,
Mm-hmm.
and they married later than you would expect, in their 40s.
Mm-hmm.
But they are totally independent. Totally independent women. I guess you just raise them like that.
Yeah.
This painting was done by Hettie Jones, who, in her very
Beautiful.
she was 15 years old when she did that.
Wow.
At the High School of Music and Art.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah.
Is she still a painter, or that was just a...
No, she's
That's a great
professor
picture.
of art history at Columbia, and has been a curator. Has a book coming out in which he talks a little bit about growing up with art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my other daughter is the author of Bulletproof Diva, Tales of Race, Sex, and Hair.
Awesome.
And she was a columnist for many years for the Village Voice.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote a column called Skin Trade. Was the first person to demythify and demystify the word mulatto.
Hmm.
Just take it out of its pejorative
Uh-huh.
and just celebrate it. So now we have all kinds of mixed race people, but they were among the first to legitimize their own selves in a lot of ways.
Well.
And through art, through writing,
Mm-hmm.
that's the way you do it. I mean, you can't stand out in the street and say, hey, hey, hey.
Right. Well, speaking of writing, were you writing back in those days when the kids were little? I know you were working and involved with publications. Did you also have time for your own writing?
Well, I wrote a few poems, but, when I was married, I worked night and day, and we had a magazine, and we had publications, we had books,
Mm-hmm.
we had Eugen and Totem Press,
Mm-hmm.
and there just wasn't enough time. I have a couple of poems from that time,
Uh-huh.
but only a couple. I couldn't work on them enough to make them right, and I like to edit my work.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell my students about the shitty first draft.
Mm-hmm.
And not to worry about it, right?
Yeah.
But my first book I'd always wanted to write books for children. When I was in college, I had a traveling theater for children. So that had always been my ambition. And I sold my first children's book in 1969, only a couple of years after I was divorced. So I found a little bit of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found more time, and then after around 1970, I didn't have a regular job. I lived very precariously from selling children's books and living on the advance, and then doing freelance copy editing and proofreading in between.
Mm-hmm.
So. That's what I did for quite a number of years until I started teaching. And I've actually forgotten what year I started teaching, but I think it was the late 70s. And I only started teaching because somebody said, you want to make $50? And, and that started the whole thing off too. Yeah. But I was writing by that time. And having found myself in this odd, new kind of position where I was the white mother of black children, and I only knew a very few other people who had been in that position or were concurrently in that position. So it was something so different. And I didn't quite know how to write about it, but I figured I might as well tackle it, because if there were any subject that engaged me, that was one that I knew wouldn't go away, mm-hmm. and would continue to uh, be something that I experienced, especially when my kids were little and we walked out in the street together, or we went to an all-white neighborhood, or we went to an all-black neighborhood, which was the case in those days. So I think finding the subject, and of course I was influenced by the feminists after they made the world safe for democracy. I found that having them be nice and strident allowed the rest of us to, at least reveal what we had been thinking all along. But I very early on, and I wrote about this in my memoir, I very early on decided that I wouldn't marry. Since there didn't seem to be any particular choice, I would either have to marry a white man or a black man. Marrying a black person wouldn't have done at that time when everything was so divided. And I just couldn't bring a white man into this house somehow. So, but that was not the only reason. I had enough on my plate, and I was enjoying being single. I prefer to have lovers. It's not a bad deal.
No.
Financially, I wrote to my friend Helene, my correspondent, Helene Dorn, with whom I had a 4-year correspondence. So here's to divorce, I wrote. It was referring to someone who had just gotten divorced after a long time, or whose husband had died. And I wrote, here's to divorce, if only poverty didn't come along with it. So, yeah, but that's the difficulty is, unless you're rich, it's a bit of a struggle.
So when you started writing about your experiences, what gave you the confidence to shape that into the manuscript of a book and submit it and ultimately win a prize for it?
Well, I had been writing poetry, and I had been before my first poetry book, Drive, which came out after my memoir. So actually, I wrote 13 children's books between 1969 and the publication of Drive, or the publication of my memoir, which I started writing in around 1986. But prior to that, I'd been writing stories, and they were published singly in little magazines. There was a feminist magazine called Icon, I-K-O-N, published in the 70s. 70s or early 80s. And I had several stories published in that, and poetry. So I was on my way to doing something like that. And then as far as the poetry was concerned, I had been reading it at various venues all around. I had a little chapbook out with some of the poems in it. I had met Bob Hirshon, the editor of Hanging Loose, and we figured out that it had taken me 13 years. And every time I would run into him, he'd say, "Where's the manuscript you promised me?" And I'd say, "But I'm too busy to blah, blah, blah." 13 years later, I sent the manuscript. So,
okay.
So we were talking about writing, I guess.
Yeah, and revision. You had mentioned that you really like to take time with a poem and make sure that it's just right. Do you have any specific advice about that, or way that you do that?
Well, I I try to give it a little time, and it's funny because I have an expression that I use before the poem comes clean, and I can always change something even years after, even after it's published. Sometimes, not always, but it does take me a while, and then I get distracted. Teaching is very distracting because you have homework. If you're teaching writing, you're always reading other people's work. So I can easily get distracted, and for the longest time, I ran the prison writing committee for Penn. That's another distraction. I put on public programs, a huge distraction. And then, of course, I was having to work, so in between all of that, one year, from my letters, I know that I taught 4 different places in one semester, 60 students in 4 different places.
Wow.
And that's 60 stories.
Right.
That you have to keep following. So then I don't have any trouble putting space between the times I tackle my poems, but I keep them in a folder, a very messy folder. I don't throw away the original version, nor the subsequent revisions. I print them out. I'm still a paper person in that respect. I print them out. I put them inside a paper clip. And even if I never look at the earlier stuff, I know it's there. Sometimes I go back because you can revise something to death. I have discovered this. You can revise the life out of it. And that's not good.
Right.
But
so how do you know?
How do you know when it's
it's cooked?
This is a strange thing to say, but when I finally change the final line and I read it and it sounds like exactly what I want, I very often get all emotional and will cry out of just terrible gratitude for the poem, for being able to do that. I think it's an emotional response to something. It doesn't feel like an intellectual response, although very often when you're revising, it's intellectual. Put this here or that there, or you find a better word. But when it's done, it's like, I like your expression, cooked. It's like smelling the roast. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. When it's cooked, I like that.
So